So welcome along to the industry analysis for the strategic case study exam of November 2020 and February 2021. And we're going to be looking here at the real world knowledge park, technology park, science park industry. It goes by various names, as we'll see. And before I get into the content, I want to address a question that is often asked by students. Now, at strategic level, I'm sure you're already familiar with the purpose of the industry analysis, but there's no harm in reviewing the actual reason to do an industry analysis, because of course it gets you thinking about what exactly is expected by the examiners on exam day. And often what happens is when students come in to a case study exam, they're coming off the back of objective test exams, and so they've become kind of accustomed to that approach to exams, and maybe they're a little bit rusty on the whole case study technique and what's expected. And it is substantially different, of course, from the objective test exam, the case study exam. And especially at the strategic level, it is a lot more about general business savvy, integrating all of the practical or technical and theoretical skills that you've learned from your objective tests and applying them in a practical and realistic way. That's what the case study exam is all about. So it's a kind of a shifting of gears in a way when you're moving into the case study exam, and the industry analysis can help in various ways with that shifting of gears. So first of all, obviously, you're not expected to be an industry expert. This is a mistake that students sometimes make. They get panicked about not knowing enough about the real world industry, and they go crazy. They go down rabbit holes. They lose track. They lose the run of themselves, and they get bogged down in learning everything there is to know about the industry because they're afraid that if they go into the exam without full knowledge of the industry, they're going to get caught out. Now, that's not the case. Okay, so you can disabuse yourself of that notion. Right now, you do not need to be an industry expert. You're not expected to be an industry expert. That begs the question, of course, then, well, why do we need to do this industry analysis? After all, we're presented with industry information in the pre-seen document. That is true, and that industry information in the pre-seen document is, of course, very important, and you should be well acquainted with that. But there are other reasons why you should be looking at the possibility of doing a little bit more research on the wider real-world industry. There are two key potential benefits on exam day of doing an industry analysis like the one we're going to do today, and understanding that wider business environment and industrial context. And again, as I said, especially at the strategic level, this becomes increasingly important. The first good reason to do an industry analysis like what we're doing today is that it helps you to anticipate some of the potential issues that might arise in the unseen scenario, and thus avoid any nasty surprises or confusion. So CIMA examiners, obviously, when they create the pre-seen document, they're trying to make it as realistic as possible. So they're using the real world industry as inspiration for the kinds of companies that they create, the fictional companies that they create. They often use real world cases to inspire that. And so it should be no surprise then to realize and to learn that they're going to use that same real world industry to influence the kinds of scenarios that they come up with on exam day, because they want those scenarios equally to be realistic, and they want to test your ability to operate in the real world with the skills and knowledge that you've gained from your objective test studies. So on exam day, you go in, if you're already familiar with the kind of trends in the industry, the kinds of things that go on in the industry, in the real world, you're more likely to anticipate perhaps some of the scenarios that might come up for this particular company, and you're less likely to be thrown off or caught off guard by the scenarios that come up, because you're more familiar with the concepts within the industry, how things tend to go, the kinds of things that tend to happen, the kinds of focus that companies in this industry tend to have. And then the second reason it's a good idea to do an industry analysis is because it makes it easier, at least potentially, to illustrate and apply your abstract theoretical knowledge by using concrete examples and specifics. Now, the primary source of that for you should still be the pre-seen document. Okay, so obviously, the first port of call when it comes to applying, illustrating your theoretical background and knowledge is the pre-seen information, to go to the pre-seen document and to look at the actual specifics of the company and show your knowledge through discussion of those specific details about the company from the pre-seen, and of course the unseen as well. The unseen scenario, you have to refer to the information that's presented on exam day. But sometimes you might want to elaborate a little bit, or you want to give a little bit of extra substance to your answers, and there's no harm in that situation in using real world examples from the industry. talking about some case, some trends from the real world industry, and using that as something you can integrate into your answers to flesh out your knowledge and your theoretical background a little bit more. So those are two, I think, very important reasons why it's a good idea to do this extra bit of study. But again, don't worry, you're not expected to be an expert. This is just to give you some extra conceptual tools and resources on exam day, and also to help you think about more effectively what likely scenarios might arise. And the thing about thinking about those scenarios, the good thing about it is when you have scenarios in mind that are likely to arise, certain kinds of business situations or problems or demand issues or whatever it might be, then you can start thinking more effectively about the theories that will feed into answering or addressing that issue. Okay, so that's another reason why this is an important exercise. So we'll be making some gestures towards particular theories during today's session, especially I think some of the enterprise theories. Okay, some of the E theories are very important, as we'll see and as we move through today's presentation. So we'll talk about the structure now of the presentation today, and we're looking at these are our sections here. The first is on technology parks market overview. Okay, so general sweep, some of the key trends and features of this market or this industry. And then we're going to look at some case studies. We're looking at two in particular, the Barcelona Science Park and the University City Science Centre as well. And then we're going to talk a little bit towards the end about the importance of government and the public sector in relation to this particular industry. And then we'll just finish with some concluding thoughts as well. Now, this presentation also has some sources at the end on which the research was based, and that will be included in the PowerPoint presentation that will be available on the website for you to view and download. And so you'll be able to do a deeper dive on some of these issues if you wish to do so in your own time. Okay, so let's start with the technology parks market overview. So what is the main concept of technology parks? What is the whole idea behind them? Or what's the reason for them? Oh, so technology or science parks, they can be called both, aim to foster the development and growth of knowledge-based economies. Okay, now this is a bit of a buzzword in the modern business environment, but it's becoming increasingly important, especially as economies become more developed. They tend to shift towards service sector jobs, things like that, and often knowledge becomes a very, very important asset in that context, increasingly so. And so that's why these technology and science parks are becoming more and more important, as we'll see in a few slides, bringing together private research and development programs in one physical location. Occasionally, educational institutes, of course, as well, and government funding play a role. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later on in supporting the research efforts. And of course, the university in the preceding document is very much prominent in the context of the particular technology park. So in the following presentation, some standard abbreviations that I'm going to be using throughout, and these are standard within the industry. One is STP, and this stands simply for Science and Technology Park. And then AOI is Area of Innovation. Sometimes these are used interchangeably. Area of Innovation simply refers to a place or a space or location where lots of innovative companies, organizations come together with a view to improving that knowledge-based economy. Okay, so that's two abbreviations you'll come across again and again throughout today's presentation. So Science and Technology Park is STP and Area of Innovation is AOI. So let's do a little bit of background, a little bit of history. This is quite interesting, looking at the history and development of technology parks, and it gives you some insight into the sense in which this is an accelerating and growing, very fast growing sector. So in the 1950s, the world's first university research park was established, the Stanford Research Park, which is now world famous, founded as a cooperative venture between Stanford University and the city of Palo Alto. Then in 1969, Pierre Lafitte founded the Sophia Antipolis Science Park in France, whose mission was to connect innovators and to create a sense of community. And then in the 1970s, we have Tsukuba Science City was developed to stimulate scientific discovery in Japan. This trio represent the oldest and the most well-known science parks in the world. Okay, so these were the first three. And you can see the gaps there between those. 1950s in Stanford, then all the way to 1969, we had another outside in France. And then in the early 1970s, we see the Science City, Tsukuba Science City, emerging in Japan. So at first, it was a relatively slow kind of operation and sector. And with the major institute, perhaps unsurprisingly, based in the United States. But since then, since the 70s, we've seen a really huge growth in the numbers of STPs across the world. The success story of Stanford Research Park has really inspired and spurred on this acceleration in growth, which formed the hub of course, what came to be known as Silicon Valley. So that really underscores the potential importance and influence of these kinds of institutions, these science and technology parks. They can inspire a whole microeconomy within a nation. And Silicon Valley now, of course, is one of the most important global hubs of technology, science, research and development. Since the 1980s, the number of STPs has increased dramatically, as you can see here from this chart on the right. Look at that huge jump from the 70s to the 80s, and then of course from the 80s to the 2000s, we've seen a massive rise. Okay, so this is something that is very much on an upward trend. Good news, obviously, for companies who are already in this space, like KCTP in the pre-seen document. So nowadays, looking at the state of play at the current situation, there are over 500 science parks worldwide, and their number is still growing. At the top of the list comes the USA, which is reported to have more than 150 science parks. Japan, perhaps surprisingly, comes second with 111 science parks. Although when you think about their economy and their success with technology and innovation, perhaps that's not surprising. China then comes in third, began developing science parks in the mid-1980s and now has around 100, 52 of which were approved by the national government and the remainder by local governments. Now you might think because it's China, well of course the government is heavily involved in 50% of its science and technology parks, but really government involvement is not something that is unique to government-heavy economies. In all sorts of economies you get significant government involvement in this area, as we'll see. So let's have a quick profile here of resident companies in science parks. Now, looking at this, first of all, on the left, number of resident companies in STPs or AOIs. It might be a little bit difficult to kind of interpret this chart just as it is, but you can see here the small print down below. If you look here, it says how to read this chart. 18.8% of STPs or AOIs have fewer than 50 resident companies. So basically what this means is, and I'm going to use the cursor here, look, you can see here 32.5%, that's the largest relative majority of STPs and AOIs. That means they have somewhere between 101 and 200 companies, okay? So that's the most typical or most representative segment here. The average number is somewhere between 100 and 200 companies in an STP or an AOI. And that gives you a sense of the size and scale of the typical technology park. These really are kinds of mini cities. That's how they should be thought of. These towns or mini cities where there's a huge amount of economic activity, innovation, research and development going on. That's an important thing to bear in mind. And then here on the right, you can see research and development. And the percentage breakdown you can see here in the small print again in the bottom right, how to read this chart. For 23.8% of STPs and AOIs, the people working in research and development represent less than 10% of the total workforce employed by the resident companies and institutions. Now, this is an important point to just think about for a second, because obviously the perception from the outside especially is that these research parks, these STPs, are all about innovation and research and development and little else besides. But actually, that's a bit of a misperception, as you can see from this chart. So you can see here 10 to 20% are research and development, or 21 to 40% are research and development. So these are taking up the majority of these research parks. This represents the typical breakdown. Okay, so 40% tends to be, for most research parks, the upward threshold of the percentage of workers who are in the actual research and development segment or sector, which reminds us that actually this is not just about research and development and innovation, although it is an important part of it, of course, and it's especially, I would suggest, an important part from the perception point of view. The idea that there's lots of interesting and new research and ideas going on. To some extent, it's true, perhaps, though it's more of an image thing than it is a reality on the ground. And it also underscores the importance of consultancy, for example, is a big thing that goes on in these kinds of parks. Okay, so you have a lot of consulting going on, a lot of consultancy firms, but also startups. Startups are a big part of this environment and this ecosystem. Increasingly, you're seeing small companies, aggressive young companies coming in and setting up their offices and setting up their actual business enterprises. And of course, a small component of their businesses will have some research and development going on, but they're actually companies. And so they have to have an infrastructure that reflects that. And it's not going to be all innovation, creativity, research and development. Okay, so that's just an important thing to bear in mind, keep in the back of your mind. But again, as I said, really from a perception point of view, okay, from an image point of view, marketing point of view, you still want to have a very strong research and development focus and a kind of message as well. You want to attract a lot of companies because of the perception, at least, that there is a lot of innovation, research and development going on. So then we turn now to the question of universities, and obviously in the preceding document you do get a good sense of the importance of universities and partnerships with research institutions. You can see the graph here shows that STPC universities is either very important or moderately important to their operations and success in 95% of cases. Okay, so look over here, you see universities or higher education institutes. And this is the rating from people who actually are involved in this sector. Okay, so you have people who are actually running these kinds of companies. And they're asked how important are these different kinds of affiliations and institutions. And you can see here the total 29% plus 66.1%. So you're coming in around 95%. View it as at least moderately important, but most as very important. So that university relationship, absolutely crucial, needs to be taken care of very carefully. Think about stakeholder management, stakeholder power and interests, for example. That's something you need to bear in mind. And again, revisit your stakeholder management theories. I would recommend strongly you go back and take a look at those, and that you have those right at the forefront of your mind going into the exam. And then, of course, government as well. Okay, only government is rated as anywhere near as important. So government and universities are hugely important in this sector. And you can see here again, for government, 25.8% rate as moderately important, 58.1% is very important. So they're highlighted in red for good reason. So bear that in mind. Okay, so moving on then, reasons for tenants to stay in STP. So this is tenants being surveyed and giving their feedback on why they want to or continue to stay in a particular STP. And this word, I want you to pay very close attention to the word prestige. That has a lot to do with image, perception. Remember, I was just talking about how the image and the perception tends to be of huge amounts of innovation, research and development going on, whereas in reality, perhaps on the ground, it's not quite like that. But that doesn't change the fact that perception and image and prestige are absolutely crucial from the perspective of the tenants themselves. And they admit that, they show that when they're actually surveyed. So 67.2% report that one of the main reasons, or the main reason for staying at an STP, is the image and prestige associated with it. So again, that underscores the importance as well of having good affiliations, good relationships. And that's also underscored in the second feedback point, which is links to universities and or other higher education institutes. 60.5% are reporting that that is an important factor in staying. Now, long-term tenancy is going to be really important for these companies, these organizations operating in this space of STPs, because of course, if you have a really high turnover rate in terms of tenancy, you have lots of people coming in and out, you have instability, that's going to very quickly lead to problems economically for companies like the one in the pre-scene, because that's going to undermine prestige as well. And then you get trapped in a vicious cycle, because if you've lots of companies leaving, coming in, leaving, you're going to be struggling greatly to build a brand and image associated with very permanent, prestigious institutions and companies. And if you lose that prestige, that's going to feed back into that cycle, and it's going to be very hard to keep people and tenants and companies for a long time. Now, there are several other factors, obviously, which are important, location being a very important one as well. So connections to, for example, transport hubs, connections to other companies, to financial districts, perhaps, for example, okay, and other important business areas within a city or within an economy. And then you have institutional presence and support. This links in again to those links to universities and higher education institutes as well, and so on and so forth. Now, there's one here that I want to focus in on in particular, and this is the presence of anchor companies. Now, the perception here from the point of view of tenants perhaps is not so important. You can see it's 32.8% reported as being the main reason to stay, whereas then 67.2% for image and prestige. But I would suggest that those anchor companies actually feed into that image and prestige in a big way. And so that's why I want to focus on this idea of anchor companies or anchor tenants now. And you might be asking yourself, what on earth does that mean? What are you talking about when you say anchor tenants? This is actually a very important concept in this industry. A major concern of STPs is that they're key tenants. Okay, so there's this idea of there's usually one or two really important tenants in any STP, Science and Technology Park. You're generally going to find that there is one or two who are really, really out front and center in terms of the image and perception and prestige of the STP. And these are known as anchor tenants. And the idea is that they anchor the entire park and they bring in people and they tend to create more permanency in the residents who also come in after these anchor tenants have been established. So you might have things like national research institutes or the research and development wings of major international or multinational companies and corporations. Now, I have an image here on the right, obviously, of Google. Highly unlikely you're going to get Google into your STP, but you might get, for example, some kind of project associated with Google or one of its subsidiaries, something like that. You might have their research and development wing of a particular project or of a particular branch of a major company, and that can give you a huge amount of clout and also, again, feed into that image or prestige. Anchor tenants are crucial to ensuring that a science and technology park has its backbone. Okay, you can think of it in that way, as a backbone, and may be useful in attracting other firms to co-locate. Now, this needs to be considered, I suggest, from a competitive point of view as well. In other words, this shouldn't be just the consideration of your own technology park, science and technology park, but also thinking about those around you and the dangers and risks that that poses. Are close competitors and rivals about to bring in a more prestigious anchor? How does your anchor organization compare to those of others, perhaps in your region? How does an STP manage this kind of risk or this kind of threat? Okay, so there's always that danger, there's always that possibility that a neighboring technology park or science park is going to bring in some major organization, their new anchor tenant, their prestige and image goes right through the roof. And then, of course, all the new tenants that are coming along are looking in their direction. So the point here is that if you already have an anchor tenant, a hugely important stakeholder. So I was talking about stakeholder analysis earlier. I'm bringing it up again here, thinking about stakeholder management, thinking about who are the most powerful, high interest stakeholders. And I would suggest these anchor tenants are right up there along with those important affiliations like universities and governments. So very careful thinking about this issue.